Hello, this is Rob from GRAF, and we're ready for this week's installment. And this week I'm going to be talking about salt and salination of soils. Let me share my PowerPoint and we'll get going. So the title is Camels Don't Fly, Desert Shouldn't Bloom. There's been a lot of press recently about Sudan and how they want to make the desert bloom. And irrigated desert is some of the most productive farmland. You've obviously got pretty consistent temperatures year round. You've got enormous amounts of sunshine. All you have to do is add water and agricultural fertilizers, and you can have some incredibly productive farmland that can grow a lot of different crops. Some of these photographs here are actually Saudi Arabia and others are in Sudan. And it's quite spectacular. I've flown down over Sudan myself, and the way I describe it, it looks like someone's taken a handful of green poker chips and thrown them out across the desert. It looks striking, absolutely beautiful actually. But we talked before about the water cycle, and we talked about irrigation and water availability in Africa. And in Northeast Africa, we discussed the whole issue with the Nile, which is where Sudan is getting their irrigation water from. Apart from irrigating water from rivers, you can also use groundwaters, but that brings its own issue with contamination of the groundwater and with the issue of renewability. Are you extracting more groundwater from the aquifer than is being replaced by rainfall percolating down through the land? So the water cycle is quite complicated, but another issue you get when you irrigate arid and semi-arid areas is salt buildup. The soil type in arid and semi-arid areas tends to be higher in salts anyway, but all salts contain salt, all rock contains salt, and all water actually contains salt at different levels. But when you start irrigating desert land, the issue is that the small levels of salt in your irrigation water build up in the soil. Combine that with another place where the salt comes from, the soil itself. And once you start to irrigate that soil, it can unlock the salt and dissolve it. And through capillary action, it can come up to the surface. Another method where you get salination of the soil is when you chop down all the trees. That will often affect the water table and raise the water table. And that water table then brings the salt to the surface as well, into the root zone of the plant. So it's quite a complicated process, but the end result when you irrigate arid and semi-arid land is often the salt levels increase in the root zone until the point where you can't actually grow any crops at all. An example of this is around the Aral Sea. In the 1960s, the USSR decided to produce white gold, cotton, around the Aral Sea. They developed lots of land. They created lots of irrigation using the rivers that were flowing into the Aral Sea, and they started growing cotton. But the end result was the salt levels rose and a lot of the soil ended up poisoned with salt. You can see here a picture of an irrigation pipe that's encrusted with salt on the inside. Of course, the other thing that happened was because they were diverting all the water from the rivers, the Aral Sea dried up, and that released salt in itself because the salt in the seabed was able to blow in the wind and land on the agricultural land. So it was a complete environmental catastrophe. But if you look back through history, Babylonia is recorded as being one of the richest cities that ever existed. And Babylonia developed on the back of its extremely intricate irrigation projects, growing lots and lots of food very productively in the desert. They had a very, very well developed irrigation system. One theory as to the reason Babylonia collapsed and disappeared is the salination of the soil, which stopped them growing food productively and eventually caused the collapse of the city. Peter McSparren, a very well-known agriculturalist in Africa, is quoted as saying that he wouldn't lend money to a high-value crop producer in Africa unless he had access to irrigation water. Irrigation of your land can really, really increase the productivity. It can also act as insurance during dry periods and dry seasons to ensure your crop can keep growing and you can still be productive. It can allow you to double crop land when you live in a seasonal rainfall area, so spreading your overhead by doubling your output. However, once you start to irrigate semi-arid and arid land, initially you've got fantastic results, really good output, but long-term, how sustainable is it as the salt levels build up and you end up poisoning the soil? Why it works on more temperate areas where you have winter rainfall? Well, the winter rainfall washes the soil back down through, washes the salt back down through the soil strata into the drainage system in the rivers and out to sea. That's how it's supposed to work. And that winter rainfall manages to keep the soil salt levels in balance. So you have to consider very carefully when you get involved in a project to irrigate desert land. What's the long-term consequences of it? Fantastic results to begin with, but long-term, it's very questionable. Okay, so that was my talk on salination of land. I'm sure there's going to be a few people with comments on this, especially when you consider that Sudan's announced they're going to really green their desert and increase their food out dramatically. So any comments, as usual, drop them on the end or drop me a line on LinkedIn. Thanks for now.